Hello Year 12s and welcome to this first video in the series of 2 videos on referendums. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you want to go over any information contained in this video. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can write into your vocabulary sheets the definitions of key terms or of any other words the meaning of which you may be unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. I will give you some guidance as we go through this video as to what you should write in your summary books. Once you've finished watching and taking notes on this video, make sure that you read the section from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, please supplement your Cornell notes with that information. Well, let's get started then. On this slide, I've included the 2 learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. The first learning intention is that you should be able to describe the procedure for amending the Australian Constitution by way of a referendum. The second learning intention is that you should be able to explain the factors that affect the success of a referendum to amend the Australian Constitution. One of the most important sections of the Constitution is section 128. This is the section that sets out the process for amending or changing the Constitution. Remember that the Australian Constitution was passed as part of an act of the British Parliament. The reason for this is that the Constitution actually creates the Commonwealth Parliament, so the Commonwealth Parliament was not in existence to pass the Constitution itself. Because the Australian Constitution is part of a British Act, it would normally be able to be amended by the British Parliament, just like any other piece of legislation passed by the British Parliament. However, it's not appropriate that the Australian Constitution can be amended by the British Parliament. The Australian Constitution relates to Australia and not to the United Kingdom. It's for this reason that the Constitution itself sets out the way in which it can be amended, and it does this in section 128. The Constitution is the most important piece of legislation for Australia. It establishes the Commonwealth Parliament. It sets out the role of the Governor-General as the head of the executive, that is, as the head of the government. It establishes the High Court. It implements a principle that we'll look at later on in another video, which is called the separation of powers, because it gives legislative power to the Commonwealth Parliament, executive power, that is the power to conduct the business of government, to the Governor-General, and judicial power to the High Court. The Constitution also sets out the division of lawmaking powers between the Commonwealth and state parliaments. Finally, the Constitution sets out 5 express rights that act as restrictions on the power of Parliament to make laws. Now, most statutes can be amended by Parliament. But because the Constitution is so important, because the Constitution establishes the Australian political and legal system, the Constitution is not able to be amended by the Commonwealth Parliament alone. Instead, section 128 provides that changes to the Constitution not only have to be approved by the Commonwealth Parliament, but also have to be approved at a referendum. A referendum is a compulsory vote by the Australian people on a proposed change to the wording of the Constitution. Let's now look at the section 128 process for amending the Constitution in more detail. Our first learning intention is that you should be able to describe the procedure for amending the Australian Constitution by way of a referendum. There are 3 stages that must be followed in making a change to the Australian Constitution. In the first stage, the Commonwealth Parliament votes on a bill to amend the Constitution. That is, it votes on whether or not to pass a bill that sets out the precise amendments that will be made to the Constitution. Depending on the complexity of the changes being made, this might be quite a long bill with a number of different clauses. We'll look at this stage in a bit more detail in a moment. In the second stage, the Australian people vote at a referendum to approve the proposal to amend the Constitution. The Australian people don't vote on the actual bill because, as I've said, the bill itself might be quite complex and most people couldn't be expected to understand the detail of the bill. Instead, the Australian people vote on a proposal, which is a summary of the effect of the bill. So, for example, a referendum to change Australia from a constitutional monarchy to a republic was held in 1999. There were lots of changes to the different sections of the Constitution that were required to make this change. All of these changes were included in the bill that was passed by the Commonwealth Parliament in the first stage. However, the proposal that the Australian people voted on was whether or not the Australian Constitution should be altered to establish Australia as a republic, with the Queen and the Governor-General being replaced by a President who would be appointed by a 2/3 majority of the members of the Commonwealth Parliament. This was a summary of the effect of the bill and was more readily understandable by Australian voters than if they had been given a copy of the actual bill with its numerous changes to the Constitution. In the end, Australian voters rejected the proposal, and so Australia is still a constitutional monarchy. So, in the second stage, there is a referendum on changing the Constitution. A referendum is a compulsory vote by the Australian people on a proposed change to the wording of the Constitution. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term referendum and write this definition in there. The only way in which the actual words of the Constitution can be changed is if that change is approved at a referendum. So, in your definition, highlight the words in red, bold, italicized type that refer to the referendum changing the wording of the Constitution. We'll be coming back to look at this stage in more detail later on. The third and final stage is that if the Australian people approve the proposal to amend the Constitution, then the Governor-General must give royal assent to the bill that the Commonwealth Parliament has passed to amend the Constitution. This is because the actual amendments that are made to the Constitution are the amendments that are set out in the bill that has been passed by the Commonwealth Parliament in the first stage, and royal assent is necessary for that bill to become a law so that the amendments to the Constitution take effect. Let's now look in more detail at the first stage, which is the stage in which the Commonwealth Parliament votes on a bill to amend the Constitution. You don't have to understand this stage in too much detail, but it is useful background information to have. The first step is that a bill setting out the proposed changes to the Constitution must be introduced into the Commonwealth Parliament and must be passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. There are two ways in which the bill can be passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. The first way is if both the House of Representatives and the Senate pass the bill by an absolute majority. An absolute majority is a different kind of majority from the majority that is required to pass an ordinary bill. Ordinary bills will be passed by a House of Parliament if they are passed by the majority of members who are present in the House at the time of the vote on the bill. So, for example, the House of Representatives has 151 members, but many of those members are not physically present in the voting chamber for much of the day. When there's a vote on whether to pass a bill, that bill will be passed by the House of Representatives if the majority of members who are physically present in the voting chamber of the House of Representatives vote in favour of the bill. If there are only 70 members of the House of Representatives present and 36 of those members vote in favour of the bill, then that bill will be passed by the House of Representatives even though 36 votes is not more than 50% of 151. Indeed, 36 votes is under 25% of 151. The situation is very different for a bill to amend the Constitution. In that case, for the bill to be passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, it must be supported by an absolute majority of the House of Representatives and an absolute majority of the Senate. This means that it must be supported by more than 50% of the members of the House of Representatives, that is, by at least 76 members of the House of Representatives, and by more than 50% of the senators, that is, by at least 39 senators. This is the usual way in which a bill to amend the Constitution will be passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. The second possible way, which has never been used, is where the House of Representatives passes the bill by an absolute majority, but the Senate does not. In that case, after 3 months has elapsed, the House of Representatives can again vote on the bill. If the House of Representatives again passes the bill by an absolute majority, but the Senate again does not, then, if required to do so by the government, the Governor-General can call a referendum to vote on the proposal to amend the Constitution, even though the Senate has not passed the bill to amend the Constitution. This way of passing a bill to amend the Constitution has never been used because a refusal by the Senate to pass the bill suggests that there is significant opposition to the amendment that is being proposed to the Constitution, which in turn suggests that the amendment is unlikely to be supported by the Australian people voting at a referendum. As we'll soon see, the voting requirements for a referendum to be successful will generally not be satisfied if there is significant opposition to the proposed amendment to the Constitution. Coming back to the first way in which a bill to amend the Constitution can be passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, that is, where the bill is passed by an absolute majority of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, the next step is for a referendum to be called so that the Australian people can vote on the proposal to amend the Constitution. This referendum must be held not earlier than 2 months and not later than 6 months after the bill to amend the Constitution has been passed by the Commonwealth Parliament. This brings us to the detail of the second stage in the Section 128 procedure, which is the stage in which the Australian people vote at a referendum to approve the proposal to amend the Constitution. This is a very important stage which you must know in detail. In particular, you must know and be able to explain the double majority requirement. So make sure that you include this information in your summary book. Before the Australian people vote at the referendum, the Australian Electoral Commission sends information out to every household in Australia which explains the proposed change to the Constitution and sets out the arguments for and against the proposed change. This information is contained in a booklet that is posted to every household. The purpose of the booklet is to clearly explain the nature of the change that is being proposed to the Constitution. The booklet then sets out the reasons for the change and the reasons against the change. In doing this, the booklet must be impartial. It must not favour one view over the other, but leave the Australian people to make up their own minds. Of course, people or organisations who want the change and who oppose the change will be arguing their cases in the media, and so this will also help the Australian people to make up their minds as to how to vote. When it comes to the actual referendum, that is the vote of the Australian people on the proposal to amend the Constitution, the proposal will only be approved by the Australian people and the Constitution will only be amended in accordance with that proposal if the voting satisfies the double majority requirement. For these purposes, the people who are eligible to vote at a referendum are people who are aged 18 and over and who are Australian citizens. Under the double majority requirement, the votes at the referendum must satisfy two requirements or limbs of the double majority requirement for the proposal to change the Constitution to be approved. The first limb is that the majority of all voters in Australia must approve the referendum proposal. That is, to satisfy this limb, over 50% of all of the voters in Australia, that is, over 50% of the total of all the voters in the states and the territories, must vote in favour of the referendum proposal. The second limb is that the majority of voters in the majority of states must approve the referendum proposal. That is, over 50% of the voters in at least 4 of the 6 states must vote in favour of the referendum proposal. Note that for this limb, the voters in the territories are not counted. So, for example, a referendum would satisfy this limb if more than 50% of the voters in Victoria, more than 50% of the voters in Queensland, more than 50% of the voters in South Australia, and more than 50% of the voters in Western Australia vote in favour of the referendum proposal. Now, there are not two separate votes. Every voter just votes once. It's just that the votes that are cast at the referendum are counted to see first whether they satisfy the first limb, that is, that the referendum proposal is approved by the majority of voters in Australia, and second, whether they satisfy the second limb, that is, that the referendum proposal is approved by the majority of voters in the majority of states. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term double majority requirement and write a description of the double majority requirement, including its two limbs, in there. Now, don't forget that if the referendum satisfies the double majority requirement so that the proposal to amend the Constitution is passed, there is one final stage in the Section 128 procedure. This is that the bill that has been passed by the Commonwealth Parliament in the first stage must be given royal assent by the Governor-General. In the table on this slide, I've set out the reasons for the Section 128 procedure. It's quite a complicated procedure, so why do we have it? Well, there are 4 main reasons for this procedure. Make sure that you include a copy of this table in your summary books. The first reason is that under the Section 128 procedure, the Australian people are given a say in whether or not the Constitution should be amended. This is appropriate because the Constitution establishes Australia's political and legal framework, at least at the federal or Commonwealth level, and so it is important that the Australian people have a say in any changes to this framework. As we've seen, for the Australian Constitution to be amended, that amendment must be approved at a referendum which satisfies the double majority requirement. That is, the amendment must be approved by the majority of Australian voters and by the majority of voters in the majority of states. Australian voters are able to make an informed decision on whether or not to support a proposed change to the Constitution because the Australian Electoral Commission provides them with information about the proposed change before they need to vote at the referendum. The second reason for having the Section 128 procedure is to deliberately make it difficult to change the Constitution. The Constitution can only be changed if that change is approved by a substantial majority of voters. This means that changes are not often made to the Constitution. Indeed, out of the 44 referendums that have been held to change the Constitution, only 8 of those referendums have been successful. The advantage of this is that it promotes stability. As I've said, the Constitution establishes the structure of the Commonwealth political and legal systems, the lawmaking powers of the Commonwealth Parliament, and the division of lawmaking powers between the Commonwealth and state parliaments. It would lead to instability if these arrangements were to be frequently changed. The third advantage of the Section 128 procedure is that voting is compulsory. This means that every Australian voter must vote in the referendum. This in turn means that the views of the whole of the Australian community on the proposal to change the Constitution will be represented. And the fourth reason for the Section 128 procedure is to protect the smaller, that is the less populous, states. For the Constitution to be changed, that change must be supported by the majority of voters in the majority of states. This means that even if a referendum proposal is supported by the majority of voters in the most populous states, that is Victoria, New South Wales, and nowadays Queensland, that change will not be made unless the majority of voters in at least one of the less populous states, that is Western Australia, South Australia or Tasmania, also support that change. This prevents the Constitution from being amended in a way that favours the more highly populated states. This is probably not such an issue nowadays, but it was a significant concern around the time of Federation. Our second learning intention is that you should be able to explain the factors that affect the success of a referendum to amend the Australian Constitution. I've set out 6 of these factors in the table on this slide and the next slide. Make sure that you include this table in your summary books. Note that the double majority requirement is not itself a factor that affects the success of a referendum. Instead, the factors that we're looking at are factors that affect the likelihood of a referendum satisfying the double majority requirement. The first and probably most important factor is bipartisan support. Bipartisan support exists where both the government and the opposition support the referendum proposal. If there's not bipartisan support, that is, if the opposition opposes the referendum proposal, then it is much less likely that the double majority requirement will be satisfied, because opposition party voters are likely to vote as the opposition suggests, which is against the referendum proposal. The second factor that can affect the success of a referendum is community opposition. Even if there's bipartisan support for a referendum proposal, the double majority requirement might not be satisfied if there is significant community opposition to the proposal. For example, in the 1988 referendum, it was proposed, among other things, to include in the Constitution the right of individuals to freedom of religion. However, there was significant opposition to this proposal, especially from the churches, because there was concern that if people had a constitutionally entrenched right to freedom of religion, then they could rely on that right to require church schools to enrol students of other religions. As a result, this referendum proposal did not achieve the necessary amount of support at the referendum. The third factor that can affect the success of a referendum is opposition from the states. For example, as where state premiers oppose a proposal to change the Constitution to give the Commonwealth Parliament more powers. Again, such opposition might encourage many voters to vote against the referendum proposal. Indeed, all 17 referendum proposals to increase the Commonwealth's economic powers at the expense of the states, for example, by taking away powers of the states to raise taxes and spend money and instead giving those powers to the Commonwealth, have failed. These 3 factors, lack of bipartisan support, opposition in the community, and opposition from the states, illustrate how hard it is to satisfy the double majority requirement unless the referendum proposal has substantial support. As I've previously mentioned, there have been 44 referendum proposals to change the Constitution since Federation in 1901, but only 8 of those referendums have been successful. The other referendums have failed because at least in part, they didn't achieve the high level of voter support that was needed to satisfy the double majority requirement. The fourth factor that can affect the success of a referendum is voter conservatism. Voters tend to be conservative, and so they'll vote against changing the Constitution unless a very compelling case for change has been made. For example, in 1999, a referendum was held to change Australia from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. This referendum failed in part because many voters couldn't see that there was any compelling reason for the change, as the model of a constitutional monarchy had served Australia well in terms of giving it a stable system of government. The fifth factor that can affect the success of a referendum is the complexity of the referendum proposal. Where the referendum proposal is complex, voters may vote against it because they don't understand it or because they disagree with just some aspects of the referendum proposal. I've already mentioned the 1988 referendum, which proposed that the Constitution should be changed to directly give to individuals a right to freedom of religion. Well, this was only one part of a very complicated suite of changes that were being proposed to the Constitution, including having Commonwealth elections every 4 years, having fair elections throughout Australia, having the role of local government recognised in the Constitution, and including other individual rights in the Constitution in addition to the individual's right to freedom of religion. The explanatory booklet that was published by the Australian Electoral Commission was 31 pages long, and so it is likely that many voters voted against these changes simply because they were too complex for the voters to understand, or because they disagreed with just some of the changes, even if they agreed with others of the changes that were being proposed. And the sixth and final factor that can affect the success of a referendum is that referendums are often held at the same time as an election for the Commonwealth Government. This is because it is very expensive to hold referendums. For example, the 1999 Republic referendum cost more than $66 million. And so, to minimise this cost, referendums are generally held at the same time as a Commonwealth election. However, the problem with this is that voters are likely to be more focused on who to vote for at the Commonwealth election rather than on the referendum proposal. As a result, voters are less likely to give proper consideration to the referendum proposal, and so they're more likely to vote against it because they haven't had an opportunity to properly consider it. Well, that brings us to the end of this first video on referendums. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. First, you should be able to describe the procedure for amending the Australian Constitution by way of a referendum. And second, you should be able to explain the factors that affect the success of a referendum to amend the Australian Constitution. Don't forget to read the section from the textbook referred to on the first slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, make sure that you supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Thank you for your attention.